Hola, buen día. I'm short. Muchas gracias por invitarme a la Bienal aquí en Buenos Aires. He estado en Argentina 3 veces y he disfrutado cada visita. La arquitectura y el paisaje son muy hermosos aquí en Argentina. Mi español no es muy bueno. Por favor, permítame dar mi conferencia para ustedes en inglés. Creo que usted va a disfrutar de la traductor, la voz de más de mi propia. Gracias. My company is named Snøhetta. It is the name of a mountain in central Norway. It translates to snow cap, so it's something you may be familiar with from the Andes here in South America. A beautiful mountain where landscape and architecture often feel very closely connected. We very regularly travel to this mountain, and we climb to the top of the mountain when we can. So this past year, we had 170 of our office climb the mountain of Snøhetta. It's a great deal of fun, and we learn a lot about each other in the climb. This is the picture of the very first climb that we made there when we started the company in 1989. So we will be 30 years old next year. Many people think of us as Norwegian, and we have a great deal of Norwegian heritage, but we also have American heritage. Elaine and myself are American, and we have offices now in many parts of the world, including New York, as well as Paris. We're opening an office next week. We have an office in Hong Kong and San Francisco, and in Austria, in Innsbruck. So we like to think that we are connected to the world. We believe architecture is a world culture as well as a specific local culture, and we're trying to connect these two ways of thinking in each of our studios. The project that we are most well known for is the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, which we designed as an international competition in 1989. We were all very young when we designed this competition. None of us were over the age of 30, so I was 28, and some of my partners were 29, 30, and just over 30, maybe 31. So we were very young, we had almost no money, and we were completely unknown. But it was an anonymous competition, so we think they maybe thought it was someone more famous who delivered this design when they chose it, because when we arrived to take the prize, they asked us who we were and looked at our very young faces and said, "Oh my God, you can't be the architect. You're too young to be the architect." And our response was, if you chose an older architect, they will be dead by the time this project is finished. And it took us 13 years to make this building, working night and day, every day of the week. But we finished, and it's existing in Egypt. It was the place where the democracy movement began in North Africa, as you remember, back in 2011. And in fact, the library housed the first talks of democratization in Egypt. As the riots began, we were receiving pictures like this, in which the site of the library is where that fire is coming from, behind these apartment buildings. So our first reaction was, oh, the library is burning. As some of you know, the Great Library of Alexandria disappeared over 2,000 years ago. Some people believe it burned to the ground, and so we were afraid that it would burn again. But in fact, those fires came from a nearby area. They weren't the library. And what we found was the next day, goes a little fast. The next day, the people of Alexandria had formed a human chain around the library to protect it from damage. And these were both pro-government and anti-government groups that were involved in protecting this piece of architecture. So you as architects must recognize that the things we do have enormous value often to the people that use them. And the theme of this Biennale is situations, or what happens to buildings after they are built. And I will hope to describe some of those issues with some of the projects tonight or today. This being the first interesting idea that people will attach themselves personally to your work if they believe in it, and they'll even risk their lives to protect it. After the building was opened, even during the period of the revolution, the building was heavily used, and you can see some of the statistics here. I can tell you that we do, from time to time, go to our projects after they are finished and evaluate what is a success and what is a failure. I wish we could only talk about our buildings years after they're built. And I wish that we could only put our buildings in magazines years after they were built. But the pressure of the media is to publish the day the building opens. But I think we find that our buildings have a history and a life, and we can learn more from them after they grow up and become young adults than we can when they're still wearing diapers just after they opened. So here we see an increase in use of the building, membership of the library increasing. The revolution was in 2011. There's no data during the 2 years of the revolution, but a drastic increase not only of general use and membership, but also of young children. So we opened the building with a young person's library for about 200 seats, and we have since had to expand it to 800 seats, and it continues to grow. So the value of the building to different age groups is changing since the time at which we opened it. I should also say that when we opened the building, the internet really didn't yet exist as a useful tool to most people as we began the design. By the time we finished, internet was being more and more used. So the library also had to change to accommodate new information technology. Another interesting feature is the growth between gender use in the building. When we started the building in Egypt, very few women or females used the building, and it was generally considered inappropriate for young girls especially and young women to use this type of educational facility. But over time, the building has generated a great deal of interest in gender equality. And now, as you see here in this picture, there are school groups of young girls who are able to learn about the library and learn about architecture in a way they hadn't before. So more and more women are being invited into the building. And in fact, the statistics are interesting. As time has grown, they've even generated programming for women. So they lit the library roof pink for Breast Cancer Awareness Week in Egypt, which really was something that could have never even been discussed when we began the project. If you were to use the word breast in Egypt, people would probably get very angry, but now it's openly used as a topic, and notions of women's health are becoming more and more in commonplace discussion. And even the gender use of the building is matched by those that work in the building. So more and more women are working in the building. They can handle money, which they weren't able to before, and they have some mother facilities for young children. Again, not at all possible before this building, which was dedicated to culture and enlightenment. This was not at all possible before this building was built. So the architecture and the programming of the building can have consequence also beyond the physical form that we normally appreciate with architecture. We are also well known for the opera in Oslo. This is the National Opera. It also houses the National Ballet, so it's a ballet opera, two groups together inside this building. If you know anything about ballet and anything about opera, you know that the needs of each group are entirely different. The opera requires a narrow stage and a great deal of acoustics. A ballet requires a very wide stage, and they don't like sound of their toes and their feet and their dance projecting to the audience. So the joke while working on this building was that if anything is working 100% perfectly, then somebody has made a mistake. Because you can't solve everything for each group, someone else will suffer. And so we had to balance all of those things. In addition, the challenge of creating a very expensive building in a society that doesn't always appreciate culture. Why should we spend money on an opera? It's a small audience, 1,200 people in a room. We could use the money to build other things. These were the same arguments that existed when we built the Library of Alexandria. Why should we spend money on a building when we should be growing food or fixing hospitals? And the response I have is always the same. Yes, we must spend money on food, and we must spend money on hospitals, and we must build cultural institutions for our people. Culture, health, and medicine are all very important things. They're separate discussions. So governments need to learn how to manage their budgets so that we can build culture, health, and welfare equally across all of the society that uses these places that they govern. One of the interesting features which you just saw is that the opera can be, oh sorry, I will go back. The opera can be climbed on, so you can climb on the roof of the opera without a ticket. So the building gives public space to the city of Oslo and to visitors, and you don't have to pay anything. So while the building was very expensive, it has a free surface that anyone can use, and you get a free view of the city that's rather unique and very special. Since the building opened, about 9 million people have climbed the roof of the opera, and the opera has sold out its tickets almost every show, which they were never able to before. So all kinds of improvements have been made based on simply the visitation of this building, whether it's by ticket or if it's free to those who walk on the roof. The interior of the room is rather beautiful and warm and made with wood that has been naturally stained using gas rather than chemical liquids. The project is very environmentally friendly. We removed 60,000 tons of pollution in the water where the building is located to make it. And we used naturally positive natural components to clean and treat the materials that the building is made of. Here you can see a concert on the outside of the opera. So in addition to having concerts inside, you can have an event outside. And it's rather wonderful to see. In this case, there were about 5,000 people who were coming to see a show of Carmen, which was inside the building. So 1,200 people bought tickets inside, and 5,000 watched a television broadcast outside at the same time. So it had a dual purpose, and that was quite interesting. This is not the biggest outdoor concert we have had on the roof of the opera. The biggest was when the pop star Justin Bieber played outside, and there were 35,000 crying teenagers on the roof of the opera. I think it's the building we've had with the most crying teenagers ever occupying it. It was very special to see. There are interior performances and rather special interior works by artists. This is the artist Olafur Eliasson, who made the cladding of the lobby area that you can see here. Outside the building, it's possible to walk down the roof and down the plaza and actually touch the fjord, touch the water. So we have brought the natural landscape back into the city. You're well aware of this in Buenos Aires. It's very difficult to actually get to the water. There are a few places you can get to the water, but for the most part, the water's edge has been engineered away from contact by people. So in this case, it's true in Oslo too. There are highways and walls and barriers to the water. But at the opera, you can walk right down and touch it. So people bring their children. Because we removed the pollution from the water here, you can now swim in the water here in the bay, and you can launch your boat from the opera. The wildlife returned, so these two swans now are often there. It's funny, you never saw a bird or any fish before the building was built, but now that it's built, there are birds and fish all the time. And I guarantee if you go to the opera, you will likely see these two swans. They've just stayed. They made it their home. I think it's because the building looks a bit like a swan, but that's just me. There's also, very unusual creatures like this human being up here on the top right who knows what he's doing, but he's kind of part of the wildlife. When the opera opened, we were very nervous to see what the headlines in the newspaper would be, that the architecture was good or the acoustics were good or bad. And so we stayed up very late at night waiting for the first headlines. And the first internet headline that came from the National News Service in Norway said this, which in Norwegian was the headline I translate in English: "A couple was caught having sex on the roof of the opera during the opening." So it was nothing about the architecture. Somebody wanted to go to the opening, climb to the roof of the opera, and have sex. And so apparently, when they were discovered, they were politely asked to leave and finish their activities elsewhere. And I always, at first, was very nervous about that headline. But in retrospect, thinking back, it's kind of a nice thing when somebody felt excited enough to have sex on your building. So this could be a winning proposal. I wanted to show you this film, which somebody sent us. It's loud. Yes, that was completely illegal, so do not do that. That video was sent to us by an anonymous person who was together with the motorcycle driver, and they just decided to go out without permission and ride their motorcycle up the building and do some crazy stunts. It was amazing to see and very funny to receive in the mail. And so I suppose one other thing that you can expect with your buildings is that people will use them in ways that you have never considered. I suppose number 2 on the list after having sex on the building is drive motorcycle over the building, and that's a success point. So very interesting how people feel they can occupy space as it evolves. Another project which is very interesting in terms of how people connect to the architecture is the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York City that is dedicated to the events of September 11th in 2001, when the World Trade Center towers and a number of other places were attacked by terrorists in planes. It was a terrible and tragic event, and the rebuilding of that site, if you have never been there, is very hard to comprehend. I suppose an equivalent would be knocking out a very large portion of downtown Buenos Aires, losing your public transportation, losing your government systems, losing electricity. A number of tremendously difficult situations evolved from that day. So to rebuild that site means that you have to work with trauma or people who have a traumatic psychological connection to this place. Our project was to build one of the only buildings on the memorial site. You can see the small pavilion between the two pools where the World Trade Center towers once existed. The pavilion is quite small in comparison to the tall skyscrapers that exist around it in New York City. Sometimes I like to say that building small is a luxury. Building big is a kind of gluttonous or sort of overwhelming activity. But building small is truly a luxury in a big city. So we wanted to work with the small character of the building. We worked with daylight so that the facade of the building would create daylight. It's a stainless steel which has microscopic scratches in it that collects the sunlight and ambient light, so it doesn't need to be direct sunlight. It collects light and reflects it off the building. So this facade that you're looking at is actually the north facade of the building. It gets no direct sunlight at all, but you can see these bright flashes of light that's coming from all of the ambient light that exists, and it's being put through the reflective character of the facade and then pushed back out into the environment. So the building is always filled with light, and one of the characteristics we were most interested in creating here in this place of sadness was to allow people to have a sense of happiness and a sense of optimism. And light is the first step that allows us to see an optimistic future. And understanding ourselves is also interesting. Here you can see up through the atrium, past the original columns of the original World Trade Center towers, beyond to the new World Trade Center tower in the distance. So the two layers of time are overlapping here as you stand in the space and look out to the surroundings. As you look out, you'll often see people looking in. And I love this picture because one of the things that we said to ourselves as we started this project, it was, if we could bring one smile to one person in a place of such deep tragedy, we will have succeeded. And one day I was in the building going down the stairs, and I looked out and saw this young girl and her mother taking a picture of her reflection, and she's smiling at her reflection in the glass, and it just felt so good. And what's interesting is that as you look out, you're seeing people looking back at you, and you begin to understand the connection of ourselves to each other. So this picture is a very unusual picture to appear in an architecture seminar. It's two people who apparently are very angry at each other, and they're having a fight. And one's hit the other, and who knows what has happened, but something has happened in which the two feel very angry. When you see a picture like this, we tend to blame everyone else except ourselves. So we'll say, oh, the man on the left clearly offended the man on the right. Or we'll say the man on the right is very aggressive and is not caring for the man on the left's feelings. Or we're saying some politician out there in the world has created some crazy political situation in which this kind of an event occurs. Or we'll blame it on something else. It could be groups of people that we want to align with certain political or environmental issues. We blame everybody but the architects. The architects, as we are here in this room, are apparently not involved in this. It's out of our hands. This is just people reacting. But if you look at this picture, you'll see that everything around these two individuals is something that an architect or a landscape architect or a planner has designed. The plaza was designed, the steps were designed, the buildings in the distance were designed, the lights likely in the space were designed, the sound of the environment was designed or not, but left to its own design. Everything that frames this image is what we have made as architects and designers. So how can we be innocent in this picture? A good example of what I mean is to discuss a zoo where we keep animals for display. If you've ever been to a bad zoo, you know how terrible it looks, and the animals feel that they're mistreated. And if you go to a good zoo, the animals feel a little better. So a great example would be a polar bear, ice bear cage. If you go to a good zoo, it's got lots of space around it, it can move, and at least has some degree of natural comfort. If you go to a bad zoo, the polar bear is tight inside of a space, and you'll see that it acts rather aggressive. It mutilates itself by licking its skin until it bleeds. It's hard to get close because it will get angry. It's often not able to be with other polar bears. In other words, its psychological frame of mind deteriorates because the environment within which it sits is bad. We, as human beings, are creating our own zoo. Everything around us, this room, the lights, the wood, the chairs, all of this stuff is the zoo that we made for ourselves. We can make a good zoo, and we're going to feel great in it, or we can make a bad zoo and we're going to act like this. That's why it's important what we do relates to the needs of people in a natural environment, and that we don't create artificial environments that don't allow people to feel natural, whether it's intellectual or not. So what does that mean in another sense? This is a great quote by Marshall McLuhan. You've probably read it before. He's a great philosopher. The environment humans create becomes their medium for defining their role in it. Everything we make is how we define ourselves, and of course it defines us. And this is a rule I think that is important for us as architects and designers to remember. People are not abstractions. We learn architecture in school through abstraction. We learn forms, we learn relationships of forms, which are all very important, but often these are drawn together by formal theory that have little or no relevance to human behavior. And instead, we're told to make things like buildings or parks, and later some people will come in and use them. We don't really know their names, we don't really care. We don't care about the problems they might have in life, just so long as our architecture is finished and complete. The only way to avoid this problem is to recognize the realities of who we are as human beings. We are fundamentally irrational creatures. We like to think we're logical, we like to think we're civilized, and we are, but we're not entirely logical. We do illogical things, we do stupid things, that's okay, and we are strange looking. I mean, look at I always say, if I look at myself in the mirror with no clothes on, it's like, that is a weird thing that I'm looking at. You know, when I have clothes on, it's okay, but when I don't, it's kind of scary. You know, it's like, what is all that flesh doing there? And, you know, we like to idealize ourselves, but we are not ideal. So the worlds we create have to correspond and relate to the unusualness of who we are. There is no utopia. There should not be a utopia, or we would not be able to be human. How do we resolve this on a larger situation? We like to say that the things we're building are not architecture or landscape. We are creating habitat. Habitat for humans, and habitat for the creatures that must live with the consequences of the things we create. We are not isolating the objects we make from the places they exist within and the future that they manage. So for us, it's a very small distinction, difference, but it's a very big difference in our mind. There are two kinds of habitat. One is the one that you're most familiar with. It's called biotic habitat, and it's the habitat of living things. So it's things like plants and animals, microbes, bacteria, anything that's alive. So when we go out into the forest and we look around, we go, oh, this is habitat, because it's trees and flowers and insects and animals. That is one part of habitat, but it is only a portion of habitat. The other type of habitat that we exist within is called abiotic. That means it's non-living things. So all of the things that surround or make the context of the biological habitat, things like air and water and soil, and by extension, buildings and rooms and plazas, these are habitat. They're just not alive. But the interaction between the living and the non-living habitat is what creates the world. The two need each other. And to recognize this as you design is an important factor in understanding the consequence of the work once you've finished and walked away from it. So we have a number of projects that we're working with that are related to animal habitat as well as human habitat. This is one of the smaller clients that we've ever had, a bumblebee. We decided to make beehives because the beehives and bee populations are decreasing, certainly in North America. You may have read this in the news. There are less and less bees in the world now than there were a decade or so ago. Part of that has to do with chemical pollution, but not all of it. Part of it also has to do with the fact that we are domesticating more and more bees, and domestication can be a problem for wildlife. So if you have a bee that you want to get honey from, you build a beehive, And then when the bee colony gets big enough and makes enough honey, there's a little lid on top, and you take off the lid and you blow some smoke in there so that they get drunk and don't know that you're there, and then you pull all their babies out, and then you scrape the honey off into a jar, and then you put it back in, and after a while the bees who were drunk by the smoke wake up and they go, wow, what the hell just happened? Where is all the work that I just spent the last few days trying to make my beehive? I think personally that there is a challenge with this type of domestication when it gets too widespread. So the beehives we decided to create were for not harvesting honey. They were just making habitat for the bees so that they could live in some way outside of the honey harvesting industry. The problem is that people hate bees. They really don't like them. And if you tell somebody, oh, I want to put a beehive on your house, it's just for bees, people will get frightened and say no. So we realized the only way to get people to accept these beehives was to make them really good-looking, super sexy beehives. And then everybody would want one because they're being sold as design rather than bee habitat. So the result was that we created these kind of hive-like shapes that can be placed on the top of buildings. And there's a small entry you'll see in a moment that increases bee habitat without allowing for domestication. A traditional beehive can last up to about 7 or 8 years, I believe that's the right number, without intervention. A bee in the wild would use a place in a tree for about that time, and then once it gets filled up with muck, dirt, they will just fly to another location, the queen bee, and make a new hive. But with this, you can clean it out every few years and keep it going. Something happened. There it is. Here you can see the hives mounted on the roof of a building in Oslo. Very simple entry location. And they're really good looking, so a lot of people are now clamoring to get these beehives on their houses. And it can come with a startup kit to get it running. You can see how the hive was created in relation to natural forms that the bees may be familiar with, except on a much larger scale. And we used wood because they're often used to wood as a natural fiber for building their hives within. So it's interesting when you think about wildlife in relation to architecture. If you look at traditional architecture or historical architecture, for example, here in Buenos Aires, there are a number of buildings over 50 and up to 100 years old or more. And when you look at those beautiful old classical works of architecture, you'll find a lot of ornament. And often the ornament has animals in the ornament. So you might see a lion or some kind of animal, a fish on the building. And often you'll see birds carved into the facades of buildings. What's fascinating to me is that although we are very happy to have a carving of a bird on our building, if a real bird lands and makes a nest on our building, we immediately kill it. You know, you just get rid of it and shoot it. So ornamental birds are okay, but real birds are a problem. So we wanted to try and understand what that meant, and we created a bird's nest design that can be integrated into a building facade to replace the lost habitat that was forgotten while the architecture was being created. So where a building might have been being made, at one time it might have had a tree and there might have been a bird in it, so how do we deal with that displacement? So the birdhouse has a very simple design of a series of layers. You can pull the layers off to make different size holes for different types of birds that you wish to nest or that might nest in your building. And it can even be large enough that a squirrel or a mammal can nest inside the building. And you can see the design at the top left, and what happens is that it gets inserted into a brick wall. So earlier, just before I spoke, there was someone here from the brick industry showing those bricks with all the little holes in them. So you could theoretically create a brick that was exactly made with the holes for the shape of a bird nest inside the brick. And then you rotate it so that it can be accessed by this nest. And on the back side, where it is inside the building, it's possible, for example, to put a one-way mirror so that you can see in, but the bird can't see out, and then you can see the bird nesting. So it'd kind of be an amazing thing to watch. And so this is probably our second smallest client there on the lower right, a little bird, bigger than a bee. But all of these projects are bringing us to an understanding of the world we inhabit beyond that where humans live. This is another project that we created in the north of Norway in an area where wild reindeer migrate. So there are a few wild reindeer places in the world. This is one of them. And the wild reindeer migrate through a valley at the base of the mountain Snøhetta that we're named after. They need a quiet environment in order to mate. So the problem is that these days people are coming to the valley to watch the reindeer migrate, and the reindeer are bothered by all the people that are coming. So we needed to find a way to allow people to enjoy the experience without interfering with the life of the reindeer. And so we built a sort of pavilion with a wood bench that exists inside. It's carved by a robot arm, so it's a digitally produced element in the building. And you look out through this glass down into the valley, and if you look in the distance where that cloud is, that's the mountain Snøhetta that we're named after. It's an interesting story, and you'll see in just a moment what I mean by this. But these brackets that you see on the glass, those were not originally installed, and they weren't part of the original design. One thing that we failed to understand is that there are animals called a musk ox. I hope the translator knows the word musk ox. It's a kind of like a buffalo that live in this area. And the male of that animal is very aggressive. And so the musk ox or buffalo would come to the glass, and the male would see their reflection in the glass and think it was another male and attack it by running forward and slamming its head into the glass. So we forgot to think about musk ox. It was not on the list of things that architects normally think about. So we had to do two things. We had to reinforce the window, but more importantly, we had to lower the landscape outside so that the musk ox could never see its reflection in the glass. So a very unusual thing to consider. There you can see the reflections and where the landscape was lowered out front to make the vision of the animal not clear, and the reflection of the sky in the pavilion where it sits. Here you can see the musk ox. They're quite beautiful. Maybe you've seen them before. I don't believe they exist in the Andes. There are some in Asia, I know, and some in Northern Europe. They're like a buffalo, and they like to herd around these buildings because, like many creatures, they like something that they can call home. So this object in the vast terrain is like a home, so they often collect around it. It's very interesting to see. That's a very big client. Sometimes when we climb the mountain, we come down and stay in the pavilion. Here's a big group of us on the last trip, and then we took a picture outside. That's all of us, the 170 or so people from the office that flew in from all over the world to climb this mountain. I think we are truly crazy because we don't give anybody any safety instructions, and like some of these people are from Hong Kong and we're telling them to climb a mountain, we're happy that nobody gets hurt, certainly. But everybody enjoys their trip up and down the mountain, and we often have a party afterwards. Another project we're working on is a reconstruction of a waterfall, very unusual project. So a waterfall in Oregon used to run as one of the largest waterfalls in North America. By South America standards, it might be relatively small, but by North American standards, it was very large. The second largest waterfall behind Niagara Falls in the United States and Canada. But the waterfall over the years has been industrialized. All the water was diverted to different factories, and no longer is the waterfall able to have water flow over it. So essentially the waterfall is dead. Now the industry has moved out, and once the industry has gone to places like China or other places where labor costs are different, the factories have no longer any use to anyone, and the diverted water is not being used by the factories. So there's not only a dead waterfall, but a dead industrial environment. And then the last thing is there are indigenous people that live in the American Northwest. You might call them Indians, but indigenous people. And the indigenous people consider this waterfall sacred in their history, so they also have a claim to this place. So we're having to rebuild the waterfall, deal with the dead industry, and make an agreement with the indigenous peoples as to how they can connect to the waterfall. So as you can see here, and I'm sorry the pointer really doesn't seem to work. Oh, there it is. Today, this is when the waterfall is in full position where it's rained and they've opened some valves upstream. But the waterfall used to run all the way along on either side, both sides. So all that's left is this. And most days, it's only the water flowing just in this one location. This is dry. And none of this is accessible by the public. So it's all dangerous and empty buildings. And so we're trying to bring the public back to the space, allow the indigenous people to have access directly to the waterfall, and preserve some of the buildings that are important historically to the people that colonized the area. Here you can see a view of what it feels like to be there. It's in unbelievable disrepair, rather beautiful in its sort of terribleness. It's a very hard place to be, but also very beautiful at the same time. And so we tried to figure out how can we keep some of these structures and still let the water run where these buildings exactly are. So the first thing we had to recognize was that the indigenous people would like to use the waterfall more often. They still use it once a year to hunt for an eel. In English, it's actually called a lamprey. It's a kind of an eel. And they actually fish it with their hands. So the eels come over the waterfall and they reach out and they grab them and put them in a bag. It's amazing to see. And so they have those needs, the Native Americans, but they have other reasons to worship this place, and so we need to provide space for them. Likewise, the industrial area has meant something to many of the white colonists that came in from the east of the U.S., and so their history also has value, and we have to understand how to protect that. Their leisure needs, we need to look at the wildlife and the plants and the animals that used to live here and that might live here in the future. So we've been measuring all of the different types of wildlife that should be in this place to see how we can recreate their habitat. So here you can see the edges of the existing situation. And what you see here is like a big parking lot, big flat space. So if you walk along this road and turn into this parking lot, you'd think everything was flat. But we discovered when we were climbing around the space, figuring out what to do, under the concrete is the natural terrain of what was there before the industry moved in. So they built everything on columns, and it's floating above the natural landscape. So we recognized we could pull these concrete surfaces up and re-expose the landscape and allow the water to flow back along the edge of the waterfall. So here you can see, maybe you can see how we did it. This is the concrete parking lot that I was describing before, and what we're doing to it is pulling the concrete up, re-exposing the terrain, revegetating the terrain, and allowing the water to move from its existing locations through these spaces and down into the river. And it will move along all of these spaces as we allow the water to flow under these surfaces, because, as I said, it's natural landscape under there, and it will reappear in other locations. And we're redefining habitat in some of these industrial spaces where we will put landscape in them and create new places for birds and other animals to live. Here you can see some views of how that will be once we're finished. And this is an amazing building here. In this case, we are allowing the water to run through the building under your feet. And as you stand up here, you can look down and see the waterfall running. So you're experiencing both the historical architecture and the natural phenomenon at one time. And here's where water is coming around the edges and spilling over. And at certain times of the year, this will flood and be completely underwater because we're reopening streams upstream. Apparently I'm hitting Some funny button. There you go. I'm hitting the blackout button. Here you can see that structure I just mentioned to you, where you can walk along that wire frame, look down, and it gives you access out to where the waterfall is, so you can enjoy it for the first time in about 150 years. We'll cut through some of the concrete structures and build bird nesting areas at the top where people can't touch them, and once again provide access to the water's edge so that the people will feel they can enjoy these structures. Once again, here's some more habitat we're building in to these old concrete structures, concrete and steel. This is a beautiful one. It's a silo, and you walk through the silo on a wire bridge, and it has a dome top with an oculus. And so when the water flows below you, the sun comes through the oculus and reflects back up into this space, and you'll hear the water and see the reflection of the light off the water at the same time. Should be very magical. Here's another building that we're ripping all of the facade off, which is very dangerous metal facade, and planting a forest inside of it and making some play areas for children, and as you can see, removing more concrete to expose the natural terrain. And this is looking at that building where there's a fun children's slide. If I were a kid, I'd really love to climb up there and slide down this thing. And then this on the left is this concrete tank that I showed you, a big circular tank. It's currently empty and concrete, and we're going to fill it with soil and make a garden inside of it that you can walk around. Another place where you're looking off to some of the cultural facilities. We're leaving the brick chimneys exposed. This has led to a number of other projects along the water. This is our most recent and rather famous project. It's in the news, I think, everywhere right now. It's called Under, and it's a restaurant which you enter on the ground up above, and it ramps down under the water, and you eat under the water with a window facing the ocean under the sea. So it's amazing sort of sloping building, and here you can see it in the distance. It's one piece of concrete that was made using oil platform technology. It was built in a shipyard, and it's been brought by boat to this location and dropped into place. It actually opens in a month, so although I only have renderings right now, the building is nearly complete, and I think it's fairly easy to find online if you look up Under and Snøhetta. Either something really weird will come up, who knows what Under Snøhetta will bring you, maybe Sex on the Opera, or it will bring you to this building. You can see how it works. You come down under the ocean, and what's important about this building is it's not just for commercial use. So the concrete has been treated on the outside to maximize marine life, so it will grow oysters and shellfish on the outside surface. And we're training the fish to come here so that they will have a safe place to find food and an environment for mating. One of the ways in which we're bringing the fish here is there's a music played once a day, and food is put out when the music plays, so they always know when they hear that song they can go to the restaurant, which is usually when the diners are there. So we'll see how that works. But it is an interesting proposition to create a commercial work that is also about developing a marine habitat. We have a number of these projects, but a smaller project which was fun was an urban project in which we made a park that rocks like a rocking chair. So we made a little garden that you could sit on and rock back and forth as if you were in a rocking chair, and it was to be placed on the sidewalk in San Francisco. This is our first sketch, and here you can see us building it. We have a little studio in San Francisco. It was really fun. We built the entire garden inside our studio and then brought it out to the place where it was to be installed. It was really great, everybody having a grass growing in the studio. The problem was we had one of the architects had a dog, and the dog just constantly wanted to pee on the grass. So we had to spend a lot of time telling the dog it couldn't pee on the grass, which was a very strange thing to do in an architecture studio. But we eventually finished it, and it was set up, and it became very popular. It was up for about a week. They want to build some more of these. The kids really loved it because the children really liked rocking on it. It was safe and soft, and it smelled good. The grass was smelling very good. So it was an interesting way of bringing a small park into a very busy city like San Francisco. Working with children is always fun, and if you've never had the opportunity to do something where the children are the client, I hope you will get that opportunity one day, because kids just are so open and crazy. And you as an adult, you can more or less propose any crazy idea, obviously as long as it's safe, and everybody will sort of accept it because it's for kids. And when it's for adults, we say, oh no, that's not mature. But for kids, it's okay. So in this particular case, we were asked by the Swarovski company. Swarovski are the company that make crystals. You've probably seen them sold in various jewelry stores. And they wanted us to design a place for their workers to have lunch and to sort of find some amenities, some things that are good for them on their campus. And they also wanted a children's playground. And so they thought we would put all the emphasis on the adult facilities and just put the kids in some sort of corner with some inflatable stuff or some balls that you jump on. But instead we put the kids in this tower. So the children are in the tower and the adults are in this kind of low concrete thing on the side. So it was rather surprising. And inside that tower is just a giant playhouse, and you can climb up it and jump on trampolines and move around it in different ways and overlook the landscape, and you have the pride of place. So we put the kids in the best place that the architecture could offer. And we think that says a lot about who we are as people, understanding the value of our children. It was really fun for the architect making the project to do the punch list, the list to see everything was okay. So this is the architect checking out if everything was fine. Great job to have. Another project that related in some ways to children was a pavilion we made in Singapore for a festival dedicated to light. Many people create pavilions that are very complicated, and their main purpose is to express the value of light in our world. A lot of electric light, artificial light in this festival. We decided we would make a pavilion that could be disassembled, and all the light fixtures could be sent somewhere to places in the outer areas of the country, in the more remote places, so that these lights could be used by people who have little access to electricity. So each of these lights is solar powered, and they each can be disassembled and moved after the symposium was over. So here you can see some children. It became very popular with young people also because it had a nice, small, intimate feel, and the lights were very soft in feel, so it was quite popular. And after it's made of bamboo, and all the bamboo was taken apart and reused, and each fixture was sent to a different location. Here you can see some of those fixtures up close. They're each powered by their own solar panel. And for a long time after this pavilion was disassembled, we would get emails with pictures like this of people who were using these little lights, in this case, a small water well near a small village. And in the past, everybody has had to carry a lantern or have a lantern there so that they could get their water at night. And with this electric lantern, they're able to, solar lantern, they're able to keep it there all the time and use it for moving back and forth at night. So a nice way of making the architecture last beyond the time that it's built. Another project we've just finished is rather fascinating. It's a monumental arch, or a commemorative arch for Desmond Tutu, who was the Archbishop in South Africa in Cape Town. Desmond Tutu is often called the Arch because he was an archbishop, so we thought to make an arch for an arch in Cape Town. He's very old, and we wanted to commemorate the Constitution of South Africa and his life as a Nobel Prize winner, among others in South Africa, that led to the change in politics that the country has today. The location for the arch was to be directly outside the Museum of Slavery, which is in the city center near the Commonwealth buildings and near the Parliament buildings, and directly adjacent to the church where Archbishop Tutu once oversaw. So here's that location in Cape Town, a very urban setting. And, oh, it's so hard to do this behind my back. Here you can see the plaza before we installed the arch. It was rather empty, sort of a leftover portion of an intersection. And we wanted to take that and commemorate the Constitution. There are 14 apparent beginnings to each passage of the Constitution. So we took these 14 beginnings of each of the lines of the Constitution, and we're going to create a structure built around these lines and how that could express solidarity in modern South Africa. So the design for the arch was to intertwine 14 pieces of wood in such a way that they would be self-sustaining and self-supporting structurally, so they would hold themselves up. And you can see that the sphere obviously is a very good way to do this. These were pre-stressed into the circular shape and then woven into each other, and each one of these wood beams has a line from the Constitution in it. And so it was then placed in this plaza. You can see it here, and you walk through it like an arch, but it envelops you in a very interesting way, different than most arches. So you feel you can stand underneath it. You don't have to keep walking. It collects people, and it's wood. So whoever thinks of a memorial made of wood, but the wood has a long life. It will last quite a long time. It's a wood native to the region. Here you can see people hanging out. There's a bench there. It just opened about 4 or 5 months ago, looking up through to the sky and seeing some kids hanging out there. So it's possible to see if you go to South Africa. There's now been 2 that were built. So the first one was successful, and the second is built in Johannesburg, in the capital. When we showed this structure to Desmond Tutu, who's very old and has a very good sense of humor, so we were asking him how he liked the architecture and the design of this big sphere. And he said, it's very nice, you know, this is dedicated to him. So he said, it's very nice, but I think you have to work harder to make my nose more accurate. So he was referring to it as a statue rather than an arch. And he was just joking, but he really liked the contemporary architecture and where it was taking South Africa. The other thing to recognize is the habitat inside our studio. So if you're going to talk about a habitat out in the world, you have to talk about life in your studio. So we often try to focus on 3 ideas within our studio: diversity, awareness, and engagement. There's one thing I will tell you as an observation. Many architects are left-leaning politically. They like to think of themselves as social conscious, liberal politics. But if you walk into their office, they're the most hierarchical, strict, communist environments that you will ever find, far from being left-wing. There's usually a boss who tells everybody what to do, and if they don't do it, they get fired. And it's a kind of a pyramid. So we tried to break this down, and partly we do that by not naming our office after a person. We're named after a mountain. And secondly, we focus on these 3 ideas within the daily life of the office. So we have a great deal of diversity in the office. You can see here some of the statistics. We're almost equal, men and women. We could be better. We're about 17% minorities, but at least we have about 13% minorities in our leadership. We're lots of languages and nationalities. One thing we're very proud of is we have 14% left-handed people. That's pretty great. Most people only have 2% left-handed. Well, maybe it's higher, but you should check the numbers. So there's all kinds of ways in which we measure diversity, and it's important that we focus on that in the development of our practice. We also like to have a degree of laughter and fun in the studio. So we like to say we liberate laughter. As you walk into the studio, there's no secretary. There's nobody to tell you you can't come in here unless you have an appointment. It's completely open, except for the kitchen. So the first thing you experience is a kitchen. And we put in a beer tap in the kitchen. So the beer tap was all alone for a long time, but then we were scared that would give the wrong message. So we put a fruit bowl in the front so we would look a little healthy. So there's both a fruit bowl and a beer tap in the kitchen. And you basically have to find your way to where you're going yourself. So the power structure is immediately eliminated. The next thing is we work with physical things. We build models. We get together. We make things together. We give a value to even the youngest people in the office. So even this person on the right, upper right, he's an intern from Mexico working in our studio at that time, and he was part of this idea of building a model as one group. So making a model is difficult enough, but when 3 people make a model at the same time, or 4 people, it gets even more difficult. But it draws you together and connects you in a way that's very important. So we like to get physical. We also are transdisciplinary. I don't know if that word can easily be translated. It's like multidisciplinary, but it's transdisciplinary. It goes across disciplines. So it means that all of the different people in our studio, the landscape architects, the interior architects, all pretend that they are doing a different discipline. So a landscape architect can be an architect can be an interior architect, and vice versa. So we move through the disciplines in a way which we hope will bring value to the discussion in new perspectives that we had not yet appreciated. This is a very different way of thinking than multidisciplinary. We also have a table that we eat at. We eat lunch together. We work together. So here's people working, and we don't have separate meeting rooms. So we try to all meet at one big table. The acoustics are important in this situation so that you don't bother people with sound. And then at times we'll also eat at that same table. So at lunchtime we have it for food. The first project that I'll dive real quickly into, we'll go through some projects very quickly, is a new library in Toronto in Canada. It was on a street which was very commercial, you can see here, and it was for a college adjacent to the street. This is the context that the building was to be built in. A pretty rough street. There were a lot of sort of sex shops and things like that, and people selling drugs. And this building on the right was the old library that they were going to expand, make an addition to. This thing on the right is why people don't like architects. I mean, that is pretty evil. There's no daylight, there's no windows, there's no way to see into the building. It's beautiful as an architectonic study. It's actually a really interesting brutalist building. But in terms of what it does for the people that have to live with it, is kind of hard. So it brings us back to the polar bear discussion we had earlier. This is going to make people angry, and it will create a kind of strange environment around it, which it did over time. So our job was not only to add on to this library, but to help improve the environment around it. So the first thing we recognized was that we needed to have shops and retail in the lower portions of the building. But rather than just adding shops, we built them with a ramp that leads you up into a raised lobby that brings you into the library above. And the shops would be at the same scale as the nearby shops. It's very funny, this one of the buildings on this street, if I can get this to work, this building here is actually a strip club, a place where women take off their clothes and men come to watch. And amazingly, it's the facade of the building is so special that the city of Toronto actually gave them $500,000 to maintain the facade as a historical object. So very strange, that kind of idea. But anyway, that tells you a little bit about the character of life on the street. So it's a very tough place and a very unusual place as a social condition. But as I said before, humans are not perfect. We're very irrational, and things happen in life that we can't always control. However, we can control new things that we make. And in this case, we wanted to make a comfortable place that was filled with light. In Canada, light is very important. So we formed the building in such a way that would allow as much light in as possible. It faced south. We molded the shape to allow sunlight in, and we lifted the volume of the building up so that it created a new public space below the library that was accessible by anybody. These are some of the earlier studies we made for the building. I like to put this here because it's interesting to see where we started and where it ended. It was this idea of making this Caribbean blue, a very soft blue, not dissimilar to the blue that you find on the Argentina flag, something that felt like the ocean. And so that was a principle that we wanted to bring into the center of Toronto. Over time, it became simplified, obviously, but still held the same idea. And the building lifts in this kind of blue panel at the corner, and then this sort of white cube up above where the library itself is. Here you can see the building as you approach it from the commercial street. Things have already begun changing on the street. People feel more safe and secure walking down the street. And the area where the building now faces the street is a public plaza that is often occupied by people waiting to meet their friends or skateboarding or playing chess, things like that, because of the sun. It's only the sun that brings people there, so it's only about molding the sunlight that makes value. These blue panels that you see are metal panels in a iridescent or reflective paint that bring more sunlight down, and because they're blue, the light gets this soft blue color as you stand under it. These are rather amazing, these panels. They are all individually folded by hand. So a single aluminum sheet was cut by a computer, where the lines on the back that you see on the left, those lines were cut by a computer. But then a human being came and folded them into that shape. So it's essentially an origami building. And they're three-dimensional and highly reflective. And here's a picture I just took with my telephone on selfie mode, looking straight up at these panels. And you can see they have different colors depending on which fold is facing the light. All of this that you see is ambient light. There's no electrical light added to the facade. So I think next slide is a film that shows one night I was there, the neon signs were blinking, cars were driving by, the restaurants had their lights on, and you'll see the effect that these panels give. So these are just lights, and this is real time. Just things that are happening nearby with changes in billboard lighting, cars driving by. All the changes in colors are just built into the paint. So every time you walk by this thing, it's looking very different. And that's very, very important. Those panels move into the inside. There's a coffee shop. We're very proud of that coffee shop because it's actually a Starbucks. And if you see, there's not a single Starbucks sign on that coffee shop. We were able to convince Starbucks that they didn't need any signage in this building, and they somehow agreed. Because I said, people are going to come to this building, they're going to buy your coffee. You don't need to say Starbucks on the sign. Put it on your cups, that's enough. Amazingly, they agreed. And so it's a kind of clean, simple space with this beautiful blue sky. The black panels that you see are acoustic, and they lead you up to stairs that take you up to the library above. The library itself is built in a series of platforms. Each one of the platforms is wildly different than the other. And so each has its own character, and they're all built around nature. So one floor is called the sun, one is the garden. In the garden, everything is green. On the sun, everything is red and orange, and so on. It's so direct that one of the elevators doesn't have elevator floor numbers. So you don't go to floor 3 or floor 4 or so on. You go to the garden or the sun. So you tell people, I'll meet you at the sun. You don't say, I'll meet you at floor 6. And that idea is really interesting because it allows us to understand our world in something other than an abstract number. So you're essentially reintroducing the landscape into a high-rise building, and that changes our connection to it. So here you can see the actual section on the left and the program section on the right. And the plans are wildly different from one another. Each one has its own character and plan, section, and color hue. So this is one of the floors called the Bluff. And there's this huge foam chair, which is really fun to climb on, and it sits in the corner. It was really strange because when we made this, the fire officials and safety officials said, oh, this is dangerous. You have to put a handrail around it. And they made us put a handrail around it. But we said to them, well, actually, it's not a piece of architecture. It's just a chair. And you don't put handrails around chairs, and people can fall off a chair. I mean, otherwise we need to have handrails everywhere here in front of every chair. So they finally agreed not to put the handrail in. So once we took the handrail off, people started to occupy it. And here you can see you can climb up it in all different ways. And people even drag bean bags up there and hang out. This is the floor called the garden. And when you enter, it's all green and lush green and rather beautiful and calming. It's for students who have disabilities, have a hard time learning. So the green helps them be calm. And as you look into the office spaces, you see the glass over there. It looks green inside of all the rooms. And if you're standing here and look through the glass, you think, wow, that room is green. Why would I want to go in a room that's like completely green? My skin will look like I have a disease or something. And as you get closer, it looks even weirder. But the truth is, because the light inside this room is stronger than the light outside, and the glass is only green tinted, then the inside effect is like it's normal light, and the outside looks green, because light travels from where there's more light to where there's less. So here's what it looks outside, and you can see there's the cleaning person. And if you go to the door and step inside, it just looks normal. So I've seen people like walk up to these rooms, look inside, see the green, go to the door, look inside, and it's normal, and then they go back outside to see it's green again because they think the light is switching quickly. But it's a really interesting physical effect. And I would say this, if we're going to make things that are valuable to people, we have to challenge people. Life isn't just about knowing everything. It's about being challenged by things you don't understand. And in this case, it's light physics in a very simple way that is attractive. The floor on the sun is likewise like in the garden. So it's from the outside, it looks like all these people are boiling alive in this red, heated chamber. But if you step inside, it's normal. But the interesting thing is if you turn the lights off inside and only allow the lights outside to be on, then the red light does actually travel the other direction. And since it's red, and Canada can be a very cold country at times in the winter, the students like to turn the lights off and they go inside and sunbathe inside these rooms. So this is what it looks like when you turn the lights off inside. And they sit there and like lay on the floor and sunbathe, which is really cool, even though there's no sun and no ultraviolet light. It's just kind of something that helps them relax. Another floor is called the beach, and it doesn't have any traditional chairs or tables. Most people sit on the floor. It's a series of sand dunes that rise up and a blue carpet, which is like the lake or the ocean. And people just drag chairs around or sit on the floor or sit on beanbag chairs. And the lights are like the sun coming from above. And anything that really happens in this room, a lot of different things happen, including sometimes on, I believe it's Thursdays, they have a breakdancing club that shows up and they breakdance in the library. They're allowed to do it for an hour and it gets really exciting and people really enjoy it. They breakdance, it's crazy, everybody's loud, and then they go back to studying after that. And so it changes the rhythm of the building. But at the very top of the building is a quiet floor where it's soft and gentle and the light is gentle and people go up there and they're just naturally quiet. The librarian does not need to tell you to be quiet. It's just always quiet. There's no sign that says be quiet. There's nobody telling you to be quiet. The character of the room just calms everybody down. It's the soft light, the acoustics, and the view that is controlled through these unusual patterns on the glass. Here you can see the scale of the glass pattern. That's a person cleaning the glass on the upper left, which is gives you an idea of how large this is. Here's an interesting thing. We went through and interviewed students after the building was built. One of them told us this. The space is great. It's unconventional. I hate having to sit at a desk and do work. Here I can do 2 to 3 hours straight working on an essay, and then me and my friends go right up the stairs and break dance. So that's like an amazing idea, you know, let's just do it and let's go crazy and then go back to studying. Physical activity is important in knowledge and behavior. So here we see some other statistics that we acquired after the building was built. People asked, we were asked which floor do they use most often, and they say that they're most often at the top floor, the sky, which is the quietest, you see on the right. Then they were asked, what floor do they most often socialize, and that's the beach that I showed you before. So they like to meet their friends and do their breakdancing here, and then they go back and be quiet up in the sky. And so what's intriguing is when you ask them these two questions, which part of the building is an enjoyable space to work and study, 93% said, do they think this building is an enjoyable place to work and study? 93% of the students said, yes, it's a good building to study in. And then they were asked, is this building an enjoyable space to socialize? And similarly, 93% said it's a good place to socialize. So the lesson here is that socialization and knowledge are really closely tied to one another. Knowledge is based on our ability to interact as well as our ability to be alone and be quiet. And that's the part of this building that we can learn from. Similarly, if you look at this statistics here, because of this new library, 72% of the students say they spend more time on campus. And before it opened, they spent their time off in non-library locations, and now they spend it mainly in the library. So even when they're not studying, they'll spend time in the library, which is quite fascinating. And here's one of the librarians was asked what they thought about the building. They said, well, I think it's great. Let's just build another one right next door. So that's the collage of two of them next door to each other. Another library we're finishing right now is in Calgary in Canada. It's a very unusual location for a library. It sits right over a subway line. The subway is coming out from underground to the overground, and it's on a curve. So it's both ramping and curving at the same time. And the building had to be built over this. So a very, very unusual place to make a building, especially a library. So there you can see the site in the context of Calgary, the City Hall on the left, and a bunch of empty parking lots at the time to the right. These are now, as a result of this library, being developed into new residential areas, new retail areas and restaurants, and all kinds of new life into this part of the city, partly because of the investment in culture that's going on here by the City of Calgary. We had to put a cap over the tracks, which was very difficult to do before we could build the building. So you can imagine it's very difficult negotiating with transit authorities. They're very inflexible, but we eventually got them to let us build this cap, and then we built the library over it. You can see the curving shape of the infrastructure, and our building takes that curving shape and makes it into the actual plan of the building. You'll see that in a moment. So here you can see we had to bridge over the train tracks to get to the other parts of the city, and this curving shape is a reflection of the train tracks below. And as you move up the building, the curves are more and more clear, and it creates this eye shape, like an eye on a person, and a fin on the back, which is where all of the workspaces are for the people that work in the library. I like the elevator sign on the left. It's just so easy to understand. It's important that people understand where they are quickly for them to feel good in architecture. Here was a rendering of the main atrium space, which is filled with daylight. And here's an image I took just a few weeks ago of that same space. It's just finished construction. And we had a wonderful ceremony in this space where 8 indigenous tribes came together and blessed the building so that it would avoid bad spirits in the future. And so that was a nice feeling. But you can see the wood sort of cycles up through the building. Because the atrium is very long, when you enter the building at the lower level, you can immediately see all the floors, and it's easy to figure out the organization and arrangement of the building. Because a library has so much knowledge embedded in it, it can get very confusing to use it. So our idea was to make it as simple as possible, but also challenging in the way the architecture represents itself. Here's some more views of that space while it was under construction. The wood is acoustic treatment behind the slats so that it has a nice sound when you walk in there, and all the light is natural from that canoe-like shape above. And we were also interested in ancient libraries. This is one of the first libraries in the world. It's ancient Greece. It's called a stoa, which is a Greek word for temple to knowledge and debate. And so in the old libraries, you would walk back and forth along these passageways, and you would discuss the challenges of the world. It wasn't necessarily about reading a book, because when these libraries were made, the book had not been invented yet, so there were no books to read. At this time, there were only papyrus and stone tablets. So they were mostly used for discussing things, and this is where Plato and Aristotle and the great thinkers of Western civilization grew their ideas within. Our new library in Calgary has a similar character. You walk along these passageways, and there's a rhythm to the ceiling, a rhythm to the book layout, and a rhythm to how the room reacts to daylight. And as you move along, this is a rendering of the children's library. You can see those two arcades coming together at the points of the eye shape that the plan is built around. Well, I don't know if you can turn off my picture for a second so you can see the whole slide. Can the camera turn off my bald head? Not possible? My bald head is basically stuck up there? Okay, well, if my bald head weren't there, you would see this beautiful light coming from under the table, and this screen diffusing the light from the inside of the atrium. So it's a special place in the building, which is very quiet. As you walk along the facades, the light comes through these crystal shapes and reflects off of the side surfaces, and you get this wonderful changing light experience as you walk along the edges. There won't be books or bookshelves in these places. They're actually, we thought about it because we knew somebody one day might want to put a chair or a book shelf there, so we made them too small for either of those things. So they have to be walkways. And it's really nice to feel all that light along your skin as you move across the facade. This is an early rendering which was building upon indigenous people's art from the region. There are a number of tribes there that are creating very interesting art in the American Northwest. And we also looked at climate and weather phenomena. This is a cloud bridge which only occurs in this area of the Rocky Mountains. And it's a phenomena where there's low pressure and high pressure meeting, and they make these bridges of clouds. And we worked on that in the development of the facade as if it were a natural phenomena reaching up over the site, over the subway line that made the curve below. And somehow these two worlds would come together. We were also interested in oil lamps. That is an oil lamp where my bald head is blocking the view. And so up above you can see its relationship to the lamp and our early study models. And here you can see the building as it's nearly finished. At night, of course, the library will be heavily used, and so it lights up the street, and the streetcar just comes right out from inside of it. So every 10 minutes or so, it will spit out a streetcar or suck one in, depending on which way it's going. And the underside of that is wood, western cedar wood. And it bridges up over this outdoor space where you can walk from one side of the city to the other without going inside the building. It's the bridge that goes over the subway line. And so here you can see that under construction. It's massive. It's about 15 meters high and about 80 meters long, and it's like a wave, a giant wave of wood that you walk under. Here it is under construction. Each of those pieces of wood were individually formed with steam and placed in panels. This was all done in Canada, where they have great woodworking skills. And you can see one of the panels being hoisted in place. They each fingered together. Everyone was unique. It was rather amazing to watch them build this. And here it is under construction. You can feel this wave just going up over your head and framing the view on either side of the building. We also created a project for Times Square in New York City, where we took all of the cars off of Broadway permanently and replaced those streets with plazas for people. This is not unusual, but we did this in a very special way, and I'll tell you about the results in just a moment. But here you can see the history of Times Square from the early 1900s up through to the 1990s. It's always been chaos of cars running into each other, and actually cars and buses would run over people a lot, so there were a lot of pedestrian deaths here because people would find themselves being hit by a car or truck. Very unsafe. So we wanted to make it safer, and we wanted people to feel more comfortable and still get all the excitement of Times Square. 43 million people visit Times Square every year, so it's one of the most heavily visited tourist locations in the world. That's a lot of people in a very, very tiny space. People just don't feel comfortable in that space. So this map on the right is where we evaluated people's proximity to one another, how they moved. We watched them in live, and we also had cameras that watched people move. And we set up a series of criteria that told us when people were angry or upset with one another, and we started to map that out. And so the red here shows you where people are really angry, and if there's any green at all, that's where people feel comfortable. And you'll notice before we started this project, everybody was angry. It's all red. So we tried to turn some of these areas into green. And on the right, you can see part of the area that we were working with. This is the Times Square vicinity. So we took the streets and we changed them into pedestrian plazas. You can see some of the pedestrian plazas here on the right, leading off to southern Manhattan, and on the left towards the north. And those plazas are occupied by festivals and events and people crowding together without the fear that they're going to be hit by a car. And we also decided not to use any electricity in the development of Times Square. There's enough electricity in all of the billboards and signs on the walls of the buildings. So instead we use these reflective buttons in the ground, and they reflect light from the billboards, and they create an interesting sense of light all the time, even when there's no electricity running through them. So they're based on the old marquees of the theaters that used to be in Times Square, like the little lights that lit up the entrance to the theater. And here you can see them in place. They're always shining like that, so you're often thinking they're lit, but they're not electric at all. They're just little stainless steel buttons. They become very popular, so some people sent us this Instagram where they went and bought some boots that matched the buttons on the street. So they kind of have become a sort of style thing, which is pretty cool. And they develop into different ways culturally over time. It's been in a few movies now, those little buttons. There are a lot of events on Times Square. Most people think it's just where tourists go, but there are 350 events a year. Everything from yoga on Times Square to horse displays and even bull riding a bull in Times Square, so it's like a rodeo. And then other things in Times Square. Before we started, we just noticed how everybody used everything. So this newspaper stand was used about 20 different ways in the course of an hour. People would have conversations, they'd put their children there and have photographs, they'd use it to hold their coffee or their drinks, or they'll eat on it with food. Everything can be reused in a number of ways. So we wanted to work with that idea also in this environment. So we created these benches. They're about 2 meters wide and about 20 meters long, and they're just completely flexible in how they're used. You can sit on them in low areas, in high areas. What's really fun to watch is the people that sit on the low areas where their feet touch the ground always act more serious than the people that sit on the high areas where their feet don't touch the ground. Because on the left, where the people whose feet don't touch the ground, it's like being a child in a high chair. You know, you just feel that you're somehow younger just because your feet don't touch the ground. So it's a kind of an interesting psychological trick. And here people are using it to lean on, to sleep on, to hang on. They stand on them at times, even though you're supposed to sit on them. So as soon as people occupy these benches in their own way, they feel they own them. And when people feel they own the architecture, then it has serious connection to them directly. Rather than being a part of the architect's life, it's a part of their life. And this is the trick in creating successful spaces in the public environment. This was some statistics we got after we opened or near to the opening. We hadn't even finished at this time, but you can see here there were 40% decrease in pedestrian injuries, 20% decrease in crime, 60% decrease in air pollution because there was less cars and less pollutants related to the cars, 59% increase or 60% increase in pedestrian use through Times Square. So actually numbers of people rose. And the result of that, and this is amazing, there was an increase in rent prices of about 300%, which meant that there was a nearly 100% increase in tax revenue going directly to the city. So after this space was built, there was enough new tax money coming from the shops at Times Square to pay for the entire Parks and Recreation Department of New York City for 6 years straight. That's how much money was made. You could pay for half of the police department's work throughout the year, so half of their budget, just by creating design and understanding public space in a positive way. So there's always a way to talk to politicians about this if you can tell them they're going to make money. And that's very important to them. As we get near the end, I just want to show you another project. We just finished the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. It is now the largest museum of modern art in the Americas, although the Museum of Modern Art in New York found out about that statistic, so they're starting to expand so they can be the largest. So it's kind of a race to see who's the biggest, which is a weird thing, but this is what happens. We were expanding onto an existing building by Mario Botta. So here you can see Mario Botta's building in the foreground on the left before we built the expansion, and our building behind it on the right. You can see that there's a Art Deco skyscraper in the distance, and our design was meant to connect the Mario Botta building to the Art Deco building so that there'd be a stepping pattern leading your eye up between all of these new facilities. The area for the expansion was to the back or the rear of the museum that existed by Mario Botta. And it was also a place where there were a number of small alleyways, small streets that nobody used because they were scary and there was people with drugs in the back alleys. The big streets in blue that you see here were very popular, and everybody used those, but nobody used these little yellow streets. They were too small and too scary. So we wanted to reopen those streets and make them more popular again. These are some of the buildings on these streets. You can see they're rather beautiful, but they were empty and boarded off. And we wanted them to be shops and things, again, that were family-oriented rather than big commercial groups owning them. So we made the building expansion having more entries. You can get in more locations. We also pulled the building away, like the school library in Canada. We pulled the building back to allow daylight and a feeling of security as you enter. Also, instead of making a square building, making this one new passage very sort of severe, we bent the building so that it would create different qualities of light as you looked through from the old to the new. So this is the expansion here in the middle and the existing Bota building on the top right, and parking lots and the alleyways below. Here's the actual building as it was finished a few years ago. We'll talk about the facade in just a moment, but you can see it rises up in this very unusual natural-like form, almost as though it were a cliff at the sea. And as you drive down the big streets, the big boulevards, you look up and you see these ripples, and they tell you that this is something other than a commercial building. This area is the financial district of San Francisco, so there are a number of high-rise banking buildings, and we didn't want this to be confused with one of those. When you walk along it, you see down these alleyways and these kind of amazing building rising up. And what I like to do is when I've stood there on this narrow alley and I've watched people, they'll walk past it really quickly at lunchtime, getting their food and bringing it back to work. And sometimes they'll catch that facade out of the corner of their eye and they'll just stop and go, wow, that is something weird. What is that? It might only be for a few seconds. It might be that they're texting their friends with their phone in their hand, and then they look like that. Even if it's only for 2 seconds, that's a victory over technology that I feel I'm happy about. You know, if people just stop and look at their surroundings for just a few moments, it's something that we can be proud of, that we are able to create as architects. Of course, usually after that 2 seconds is up, they go back to texting their friends, and then they're off again, not looking at their environment. But at least it's a moment that has value. One of the things that's interesting for me and for some of us is to look at our buildings from the weirdest possible places, to see what they look like from a place you would never expect. So we went out and saw the building from across the street, from a distance between fire escapes. Here you can see from a street further away. We didn't even know this view existed when we were doing the design, so it was kind of exciting. Someone sent us this picture on the right. It was actually from the consulate for the nation of Colombia, in the consulate building, looking out. And if you see way at the top, there's our building. And they sent this email saying, I saw your building from the window of the 30th floor of where I was. And it was funny to see it. And look at it, it's this kind of weird like thing floating through the landscape, very different from the rectangle buildings nearby. I was given this great opportunity once to climb the Oakland Bay Bridge, which is really scary, but I climbed up the bridge cable, went all the way to the top. And of course, one of the things one wants to do when you're in such a crazy place is take a picture of yourself so that you can tell everybody you did it, and they'll believe you. So I took the picture, and then later when I got home, I was realizing, oh wow, I bet our our museum is somewhere in this picture because it's not far away. So if you look just past, past my bald head there, you can see it in between those two buildings, those horizontal stripes. I was like, yeah. And if you look at it, what's interesting is it's the only horizontal thing around. Everything else is vertical. So I also say, in addition to it being a luxury to make small things, it's also often in urban environments a luxury to make something horizontal because everything wants to be vertical. And so it calls itself off as something different or unique. And you enter from two different locations into a sort of courtyard where there's art, and you can get up high and see over the art. And as you move into the lobby, there's a view through the existing building to the new. We had to change the staircase of Mario Bota. Happy to answer questions about that, but everyone was like, why did you pull Mario Bota's stair out? Actually, it didn't no longer meet the fire code, so it was no longer safe from a fire perspective, so we had to do something, and we also needed to open up views through to the expansion, and so that's our stair on the right, Mario Bota's stair on the left. Once you rise up those stairs, you're in a main lobby where everyone collects, and you move up another set of stairs to a small raised garden, and some of the galleries look onto that garden. That garden is focused on a wall which is planted as vertical vegetation with Calder's inside the gallery and outside in the garden. So Calder, the artist, is being shown in both locations. As you open the doors into that gallery, as you open the doors, the Calders move from the wind, and outside they're also moving from the natural wind. And you can see the vertical garden there, and there are, I can't remember the number of different plants, but 50% of the plants are from the native surroundings, and they're all planted in such a way which is equal to the shadow and light they get, so they will stay healthy. And it's been very successful since it opened. Here's a detail of it. More people take pictures of this green wall than they take of the artwork, which is a little strange. They like to take pictures of themselves in front of it. It's a good backdrop for art. And sometimes you see the art in connection with the building and the green wall on either side. And looking up to the sky, you see different ways of framing art and sky. I like this view because you're sort of seeing up to this very narrow band of sky between this warm